Okay, I want to open up to the audience for questions. We've had an hour to.
So this is more of a stream of comments, kind of with questions embedded in them, but we talked a lot about appropriation and appreciation, and we talked about white people not knowing their culture, specifically where they came from, and I saw like a parallel between that and African Americans and how they have been ripped from in their original culture from Africa. They don't know specifically where they came from to an extent. But the difference between those two groups is privilege, and that kind of made me think, well, it begs the question, what is the culture of white people in the American society that was created by their dominance, and is it a question of them not knowing where they came from, or is it the fact that the American culture is unclear or confused? Like, talk about the fact that in order for them to honor us, they have to acknowledge what they did to us. And there's a lack of acknowledgement there. And I feel like there's a lack of not knowing what being an American is, or the fact that being an American is more nuanced than European influence, and more their, I guess, being like Native American, African American, Latino American is embedded in being an American. So I don't know if that makes sense, but it's just interesting. I'm not sure if it necessarily is, because I mean, what are your thoughts based on that comment, if it made sense?
I guess I don't want to spend too much time talking about white folks because I'm not invested. I'm sorry, and I don't mean to be funny or dismissive of you. I think it's an important question, but that's not necessarily why. That's not why I create art. It's not why I came here tonight. I think there's a lot of information, valuable information out there. There are scholars and artists who do that from white perspectives. David Roediger is one scholar who writes a lot about white studies, and I think there should be white studies. But one thing you did touch upon that I think is important is, what does it mean to be an American? And I think that that's a concept that we have chiseled away at, where it once was white, land owning, slave owning, whatever owning. We have rattled the foundations of that structure to the point where a lot of people, ourselves included, are confused about what does it mean to be an American. And I think that's an important conversation. I mean, I think that's one of the threads that we're all talking about here. What does it mean for us to be American? Because that's wrapped up in both privilege and dispossession and marginalization and a lot of things. I mean, I think that to me is the more important, the most important piece of that. I don't necessarily have all the answers to that, but I think that we have to keep chipping away at that, and I think that that's what we're doing, and I think that's a big part of what art can do, is to question what it means to be an American. We could go on. That could be the topic of 4 discussions in and of itself, I think.
So I have one question, one comment. The question is, a lot of times people talk about globalization and different cultures, diversity, and the world's so beautiful. We have different cultures, and you can go to Japan, you can go to Canada, you can experience different cultures, etc., etc. And I feel like culture appropriation comes under that, and so under the guise of diversity, multiculturalism, and kind of we're human, what's yours is mine, kind of that thing. And so for me, I guess somehow got colonized, mentally, and sort of. And so I like different cultures, and I embrace diversity and cultures and whatnot. But I don't like go about and like take other people's dress or such that like that. But like for example, cooking. Of course, while mentioning the culture that came from or the culture that's influenced by and things like that. And so like one time we were talking about henna and how like it's Indian and so I'm Somali too, we use henna too, and it's like indigenous, and so it's like so then I was arguing with the white dude, and so he was like, well, eyeliner comes from Egypt, and we're like all appropriating Egyptian culture, and I was confused as to how to answer that. So that's the question. And then secondly, the comment about history and victors and such, and the question like, if you rewrite history, do we change and do we affect power? And I feel like, yeah, we do, because that's what they did. They kind of, there was a whole world view and system, and then they wrote down, a bunch of shit, and like, and then like, I guess like it kind of happened like they said it would, sort of, kind of like a weird self-fulfilling prophecy a little bit. And so there's power in names and such. And I was thinking about the writer Diane Wilson, who's a Dakota writer, and she talked about her, like, one of her maternal ancestors' husband, who was French. There was a creek named after him, and she was wondering to herself, like, do these white people know, like, what it means to name, a body of water, by a man's name, and the power it holds, and so that reminded me of that. And yeah.
It's a weird thing. I really like a story from Diane Wilson that she tells herself. She grew up in the suburbs, right? And she's fair skin, and one day her mother has the Goodwill come and take a couch out, and it's two Indian men come up. Well, she's playing out in the front lawn, and she looks over to her mother, and these two men are coming, and her mother greets them in Dakota. And both those men are like, what? Because they're in the suburbs, and fair skin, and all of these things. And I think to myself about the people like Diane Wilson, who write incredibly. In her book Spirit Card is phenomenal. I think about reclaiming identity, right? Like Diane does, right? She's reclaiming her Dakota self, but she's also acknowledging, that they had to hide to live in the lands of their people because they outlawed them. The Dakota are still outlawed. That's a shame, a shameful thing. I think about all of that stuff, reclaiming your identity, right? Reclaiming who you are, because it's important, right? Or, you talk about henna. Well, that's a bridge to a whole other people, right? And that's what I think about. I think about the bridges that I make with other people. I think about the things that make it easier for me to talk with someone. The connections that we make. People with clans. People that come from tribal background. All these different things. People who like comics. I think about all these things, and I think about the idea of America, right? What is that? Well, that's all of us trying to make these bridges, right? Beyond ourselves melting, right? There's this want to go together, right? To make our way, right? But along the way, maybe sometimes you just go, man, it would be dope to wear that headdress. I don't know. But I think about that. I think about reclaiming identity when you talk about Diane Wilson, because she's incredible. She's an incredible writer, And her works, I mean, are just, they're just unreal.
Now, I know that Manny said he doesn't want to talk about white people, but this is a live issue. Like, what do you tell white people to go, well, cultures borrow all the time. You know, there's intermingling all the time.
I'm dressed like a white guy right now.
Yeah. So how do we make those distinctions? Between
Power.
what?
Right. I'll be real short because I'm talking about it's about power and where you lie in the power spectrum. And if you are, you know, it's like migration from Mexico to the United States is economic survival, right? If I go down to Mexico or we go down to Mexico because it's cheap land or, you know, the drinks are cheap or the women are exotic, there's a totally different power dynamic there. And I think when we keep bringing up, well, in history there was this and that, it's a cop-out. It's a cop-out for not willing to be able to, you know, to confront your own behavior, your own participation in this destructive behavior. And it's as simple as that. They've been throwing it at us since time immemorial. These cop-outs, these excuses. I mean, it's about power and the relationship to power.
Hello, good evening, everybody. I just have two quick clarifying questions. When you all are, I heard they said a couple times, and I'm wondering when you are saying they, are you talking about white people or whiteness or white supremacy? That's one question. And then when you all were speaking about, like there was a time where you were talking about feeling lucky for being indigenous because you could go to the space where you come from, which is, I think is very beautiful. And you were saying that I feel sorry for them or people who aren't able to do that. Were you talking then about white people or were you talking just generally about non-indigenous people? And then just a quick comment. I feel weird because I wish I was in an all PLC space to ask more deeper questions. And yeah, that's all.
I'm talking about Americans. Talking about Americans, right? Indigenous people like myself, right? Where I'm from a state over. There's literally space where I come from. There's you know a region where I absolutely come from. And, you know our creation stories and our traditional stories talk about these places. These are real places for us. You know, we were the Walmart of the plains, right? Until you know the French decided that they wanted to control the trade among the Missouri and all the rivers, right? I'm talking about how lucky it is to be able to have that, because that's not an American thing, right? It's to crush this place, right? Your God-given right to make your own place here, right? To beat away nature and indigenous people included, and make your own space, to make your new history upon our bones, right? That's what I'm acknowledging. I am lucky to be indigenous. That is, this is a hard thing to be Indian, and that's not just throwing that out there. It's incredibly hard. I see stats all the time that talk about though we're the rightful land bearers, we are being hunted still. This is the truth, and we're not the only ones. You know what I mean? So that's when I talk about being lucky, because that's not an American thing. You can't do that. You have to actually invest in a long, painful history to figure out, where that place is that you come from. You know what I mean? And man, I would suggest everybody do that. It fills me to the core to go home. Capital H home. I grew up over 94 in the Phillips neighborhood, and that's my home as well. But to be able to go to the exact spot where my people began themselves, it's powerful, very powerful, and that's what I speak to.
So, I had two questions related to power and solidarity. Manny, you spoke about the question of what is victory, right? And like maybe problematizing how we come to conceptualize like victory. Grace Lee Bogg, as we know, passed just recently, and thought a lot about and wrote a lot about, from this dialectical humanist tradition, right? I saw an interview recently where there's this juxtaposition about the nature of, do we seize power or do we create power, right? And I wonder if you could speak to, and this is for anybody on the panel, right? Like just a kind of some of the differentiation about seizing power, which I would say is kind of that sort of representational politics of, we are in a position of being an elected official, or we are in a position of having our face or image on a statue that represents the state in some manner or another, versus what it might mean potentially to create power, which was something that was kind of in reference to the Zapatistas initially in this particular interview and conversation. The other thing I would ask would be about solidarity, and so something which I would say would deviate from a conversation about centering on white people or whiteness. I wonder about how is it that we begin to think about forging solidarities among communities of color and indigenous communities, particularly thinking about, I think about the relationship that black people have had over the years in regards to marriage, right? That black people traveled south first, right? That when Mexico abolished slavery in 1836, we traveled south. Enslaved African peoples, formerly enslaved African peoples, traveled to Mexico. That there were maroon societies here between formerly enslaved African peoples and indigenous peoples. So then, how do we think through, one, the histories of those, and forge solidarities here and now, and have that conversation separate from white people, whiteness?
And I think it's a great question, so why don't we end with these questions, just so you know, and have everybody just sort of address.
Well, I think regarding power, I think that power that goes from the bottom up is the most powerful type of power, and it is built in the way that we are doing it right now, by telling the story, by being part of the struggle, and changing situations and changing from the bottom up. Like the Zapatistas in Mexico would say, mandar obedeciendo, they command by following. So we are not the followers, we are the people that are making the decisions, so we go up. And regarding the networks of solidarity, I think that is very important to have, and I think that we were talking about it right here, in the sense that when we learn from each other, that is how we build networks of solidarity between African Americans and Latinos and Native Americans and everybody, Asian Americans, and because otherwise it's a very difficult situation to do it on your own. You have to really build those networks of solidarity. And I would even say that, solidarity, what does solidarity mean? And solidarity means I'm with you, and I'm going to accompany you, and I am going to, but I am not going to tell you what to do, how to do things. And this is one of the things that we see many times in solidarity. That, and I'm not even saying like it comes from one segment of society. I think that many times it comes from all over, that people feel like, oh, I'm going to tell, how they're going to do things because I know better, because I have that experience, and I'm going to teach you. And that's not teaching. Teaching should be sharing. Should be, this is my story, and let's listen to yours, and so that's one of the things that we need to start thinking about. How do we share? How do we build networks of solidarity that are based on sharing rather than on telling you what to do?
honestly, Sean, I just, for me, it's just listening to you. I have to be honest, man. Since the first time I took this stage, I was like, man, I need to pay attention to Sean, because what Sean's saying, it makes me a better ally, right? It makes those bridges that I was talking about, makes me be able to see them better. And that's honestly what I gain from you, is being able to listen to you, and being able to put it inside myself. Because, man, we're in the season where they're wearing me like clothes. I don't feel powerful. I don't. But I can go and listen to you talk, and man, I get a little stronger. And that's the truth. That's it. I really feel like being able to gather yourself around people that are really speaking an incredible truth. It's important to survive, because, man, this is the divide and conquer place.
Okay, thank you. I absolutely agree with what has been said, but I also truly feel it is important when people of color come together, and being here in America, that there should be, it's necessary to try to truly understand what the Native American experience is, and for people of color, non-Native people, to really understand their place in that story too. Because just because we may be people of color that want to ally with each other, it doesn't mean that we actually understand where each other is coming from. The truth is that the Native experience is very different from Asian American experience, Latino American experience, the Black experience. And we have nations, we have sovereignty. This is something that really needs to be understood by people of color. And I have been in so many situations where that understanding of our sovereignty suddenly gets looked at through the lens of how you look at mainstream. It's like, oh, well, you're a nation, that means you have privilege over me, and this is my traumatic story of being in America. And somehow the story always turns to who has the most oppressed story. And I just have to say right now, the Native Americans do. And that is based on the genocide that had happened and the ongoing institutionalized genocide that's happening, the ongoing murder of indigenous women all across the continent. There are so many things about Native culture and society and people that just isn't even scratching the surface. And I think it's really important to understand where your sense of colonization lies within that story, in your sense of privilege, which is a tough thing to say as a person of color, that you have any sort of privilege in certain places. How far does that extend into other people's stories? And I even know that as a Native American living in America, I know that I have more privilege than other people around the world. So it's, and I think that when we come together as artists, New Native Theater, we're part of Twin Cities Theaters of Color Coalition with Theater Mu, Pangea, Penumbra, and Teatro del Pueblo, and that's a foundational thing that we're trying to understand, is what is the relationship of these communities to Indigenous people. And it's difficult to criticize other people of color and try to point out that colonialism, because you want so bad to ally, and you need to ally. So it's important to self-evaluate and to ask those really hard questions.
I think the question of power, again, this is a conversation we could have for a long time. I personally don't believe that we are going to achieve true liberation by the means that they're handing us. And by they, I mean the white supremacist or white centrist system. And that doesn't mean that we're not part of that, or can't be part of that as people of color or as indigenous people, that white supremacist institutions that continue to oppress us, that we can't be pawns or players in that. In the next 2 years or a year and 2 weeks, we're going to be fed so much stuff about Hillary and Bernie Sanders, you know, and we're going to be so distracted and so consumed about, you know, voting a feminist platform or a socialist platform or whatever, that we're not going to see how that's a part of our own oppression. Fuck them both, as far as I'm concerned, you know? And we have to, Teresa mentioned the Zapatistas, you mentioned the Zapatistas. We have to study stuff like that. We have to. You know, that's why history is so important, because some of the answers are there and some of the history cannot be repeated. We can't, you know, the Young Lords and the Black Panthers and Iwar Kun and AIM, they had these sort of paramilitary structures, these militant organizations, and they accomplished things. But we can't recreate that today. It's a different, we live in a different world. But we can learn from what they did. And we can apply that to where we live and adapt that to where we live to build this resistance. And I think that we have to do that, and I think that art has to be a part of that. Martín Espada, my favorite poet, says that, you know, that his role as a poet is that in order to create a more just world, we have to envision what that world will look like. And that poets are good for that, for imagining a better world. And I really think that our art has to keep doing that. As much as we call out the racism, the sexism, the homophobia, the ableism that we live in, we also have to start imagining what we do want. And that's a whole other struggle. You know, is it an anarchist world? Is it a socialist world? Is it an indigenous world? Right? All of these philosophies, and we have to work through that, but we still have to recognize we have a common oppressor, and that we can be a part of each other's common oppressors, you know? And I don't hate white people, I hate white privilege, you know? I don't hate, just as my girlfriend doesn't hate males, she hates male privilege, and I embody a whole lot of that in her life, and in other people's lives. And I have to keep working on that, right? Because part of that struggle for liberation means that I have to undo some of the isms that I perpetrate. You know, as much as I challenge other isms, I have to try to work on my own and be held accountable by other people. And again, I think art is, you know, this is a lot of this conversation about art. Art plays such a critical role in our understanding of each other, you know, and can be immensely important, a backbone of how we build solidarity, so that we don't get caught up in these oppression Olympics, so that we don't turn on each other, so we don't turn on ourselves, you know. And these conversations are important, and I think they have to go beyond this room. You know, they put 4 of us up here, but it could have been any one of a number of people in this room and people that we know that talk the most. And I hope that, you know, when we leave, we continue to have these conversations. We do that research. You know, we come to these classes that David's teaching, and in those classes we're learning those history lessons, and we're writing history, and we're writing the future, because that's what it's got to be. That's what it's got to be about. So that's it for me.
Man, Oppression Olympics, that's really good, man. The Oppression Olympics.
Hey, that's Betita Martinez. That's not
Yeah, it's really good, because, you know, like, man, that's a zero sum trying to figure out which one of us is the most oppressed. But, man, I really like that so much, man.
Just for one little answer to that question is, we all have to be self-critical. And as an example, Vince and I went through an email exchange where I really reacted very defensively. Vince was patient with me, and we ended on a good note. But it was like I had to get over my defensiveness. I had to get over my sense of guilt. You know, and the thing is, as a person of color, you're always made to feel guilty. So if something happens where you recognize your own privilege, then you go like, you know, why do I have to feel this, you know? But, you know, we have to feel, right? We have to deal with these things, and I think part of it is also getting away, you know, not just having your first reaction to something, but letting it settle, thinking about it, pondering it, and listening. I think you'll all agree this was an absolutely terrific, profound panel. And like all the other panels I've done, I wish it could go on. You know, personally, I would sit here all night and talk, but I know people have other lives to go on to. So please, I want you to give a great hand to this terrific panel.